Welcome to the States of Consciousness chapter. States of consciousness is a very broad term which has led to a lot of conjecture that you see in the general media. What we're going to do is put some basic definitional parameters on what consciousness actually is and work with it from there so that you can see that there is a logical flow around the concepts that manage the story of consciousness. So to get started with, what we're going to do is define consciousness in terms of human beings and in terms of animals. And the reason we want to separate humans and animals is because oftentimes the ability to detect and evaluate consciousness in humans is much easier and works to a finer level of detail than you can get with animals. And one of the primary reasons that's true is because of the use of language, which allows you, a researcher, to access some of the internal experiences of the individual you're working with. So to define human consciousness, it's defined in a very general way. Human consciousness is what a person is currently aware of. And notice that the word aware on the screen is in capital letters. And the reason that's done is to point out that awareness is actually a synonym with the word consciousness, which means that this definition actually involves some reification. And reification is never good in definitions. So let me explain what this means. Reification is a process by which you try to define a word, but you use the same word in the definition of the word itself. So you have a word that's being explained by itself, and that itself should sound illogical, and it is. The problem with this is that consciousness is a very difficult topic to pin down, largely because it involves essentially every single function of your brain operating at any one time. Consequently, it's beyond our ability to fully evaluate in any experiment. Now, this does not mean that you cannot understand consciousness and that if you go on YouTube and type in consciousness studies, you'll find a lot of nonsense. And it doesn't make that nonsense correct. It's just a difficult topic, and it's going to take time to get through all of the material. Now, to get back to that definition of consciousness again, if the words consciousness and awareness are synonyms, then you could say that the definition of human consciousness is what a person is currently conscious of. And if I said that, that would sound absolutely ridiculous. We could also switch it to awareness as well. What is human awareness? Well, human awareness is what a person is currently aware of. Now, if you heard definitions like that, you would know there was something wrong. When you say human consciousness is defined by what a person is currently aware of, it almost sounds like it's okay. You have to evaluate the definition a little bit to recognize that there's some reification. There is no correction for this problem, however. Again, the problem comes from the breadth of the degree of what actually constitutes consciousness. Consciousness is a very large construct that involves all the activity of your brain occurring at any one time. And that's simply beyond the capacity for anybody to study the full extent of brain activity at the current time. Again, that does not mean it can't be done, it just means that we can't do it currently. Now, despite these definitional problems, researchers still try to get at consciousness, and as you'll see, this whole process of understanding consciousness really comes all the way back to 1879 and the beginning of psychology. But before we start to talk about the historical aspects of why you would be doing this, which I'm hinting at now, is partly a result of the traditional study of psychology, which is why, even though you have this problem, you have this continued set of research in an area that has a definitional difficulty. The aspect of awareness, what's intended in this story of consciousness, oftentimes, especially with humans, comes down to a scenario in which you're going to evaluate language. For human beings, a simple way to evaluate whether or not they're conscious or have conscious awareness of something is to ask them about something that's not near them, that's not in their own space, and oftentimes is at a different location and time. Something that's going to happen in the future, or maybe something that had happened in the past. So, if you're sitting at home listening to this video, I could ask you, what does your workspace look like in your part-time job? Now that's someplace completely different. And if you could describe let's say the pizza parlor that you work at while you're home, that would indicate that you have memory of that location and you could describe it accurately. And having a memory of it and being able to describe that memory accurately would oftentimes be taken as a representative aspect of your consciousness. If I asked you, even in the room you're at now, what happened 3 weeks ago? You know, if there was some particular event at that time, and you could describe it. So now it's not just a spatial aspect from your room to your workspace, but now even in the same location, going backwards 3 weeks in time. Do you have a memory of that? Could you describe it? And if you could independently, with good objective means, determine that what the person says is accurate, then that would reflect some degree of consciousness. With humans, though, there's a bit of a problem, because if there's no spoken, signed, or written language exhibited at all, nothing in a communicative sense that would operate through the process of human language, then you're going to have difficulty establishing consciousness for a human being. Because typically consciousness involves some aspect of memory or an internal state that occurs. And if you can't get at that level of detail, you start losing your ability to define human consciousness specifically. There are some odd things about human consciousness that oftentimes have been toyed with by philosophers. Try to imagine what a person would look like if they exhibited behavior but they had no measure of language. Right? So take a human being and then in a thought experiment magically make their language center disappear. What would you have? Well, basically you would have a hairless primate for the most part, and you would not be able to tell that person, oh, we're going to have lunch in 15 minutes, just hold up. You couldn't talk about what you're going to do in the future. You couldn't ask them about what they had done in the past. They would actually be living essentially right in the present with no capacity for control through language. So you would have somebody that would actually operate very much like a hairless primate, essentially. And that would be a huge difference from typical human behavior. As a result, you see how important it is to have language as an aspect of consciousness for human beings. Now try to imagine another old philosophical idea. Could you prove that someone has no consciousness even if they use language? Now this one seems rather odd, but it's actually an issue that has been dealt with by philosophers for a very long time. If someone speaks and can have a conversation with you, can you ensure that inside their brain there's actually conscious activity? Or is the person functioning like an automaton, like a robot? Siri. You talk to Siri on your phone and it answers. You could talk to Alexis and then it will answer. How do you know that another person is not essentially a stupid machine that replies to you? These are philosophical questions, not ones we're really going to follow up on, but you actually do see these issues taken seriously by philosophers, and in fact there are websites that manage or work with these topics so that people can discuss them from a more philosophical standpoint. They don't have a lot of practical value in terms of scientific investigations for consciousness, given that they oftentimes as topics don't really go anywhere in a practical sense. Now let's switch over to animal consciousness. Now clearly you would not expect there to be any aspect of language when you're evaluating animal consciousness. And you'll notice as well that the definition of consciousness for animals is essentially the same as it is for humans. Animal consciousness is defined as what an animal is currently aware of. The same problem exists here. Consciousness and awareness are synonyms of each other, and as a result, you have the same problems that I described in the previous slide. But you don't evaluate consciousness from the standpoint of language as you typically do with human beings. With animals, there's no expectation of a communicative process the same way as a human being. Certainly, animals do communicate with each other, but they don't have human language. So, for example, how do you evaluate awareness in an animal? Well, because you don't have language, what you most often want to do is assess the behavior of the subject to see whether or not it will specifically follow patterns that are associated with stimulus events in the environment. So for example, let's say you have a dog. You adopt a dog and you say, well, I want to have a nice obedient dog. I want it to be able to obey commands in my house. So what I do is I train it. So I teach it to sit and stand and jump and give me your paw and other basic commands just so I can manage the dog's behavior maybe when it starts to act up. Now, under those circumstances, you can assess your dog's consciousness by seeing whether or not it has any memory and whether or not the memory for the commands you give it actually change its pattern of behavior. So, for example, after training the dog in all of these basic commands, what you can assess is this. If I trained the dog last week and I tell him to sit today, and he sits, that would indicate that 1, the dog could hear me. And sensory perceptual processes are part of the evaluation of consciousness. And so we have a piece of consciousness in this case. Now, if the dog heard me, I know that only because he actually sat down. But there's also an additional component here that we can justify. Because I trained the dog to sit with the command sit last week, and he remembers it a week later, that indicates that the dog also has memory. So now we have 2 components that are indicating consciousness in our pet dog. 1, it can perceive the environment. 2, it has a memory. And those aspects minimally fit what you can do with a non-human. As you might imagine, you could take these same concepts and apply them back to a human being because it's the same process. If I teach you the proper way to throw a baseball today, and next week I ask you, can you show me what I taught you last week? And you throw the ball correctly so it's a perfect curveball, then I have proof that 1, you can detect the environment because you only throw the ball after I ask. And secondly, you throw the ball correctly in the way that I trained you last week. and you're throwing it today in that same manner. So we have somewhat of a level of consciousness in this case. The aspect of animal consciousness is embedded into the consciousness of humans, but typically with humans you generally assess consciousness with language itself. Now let's work with a question related to this issue. The definition of consciousness, whether related to humans or animals, is closely related to what? And the answer is B, behavioral psychology. Back in chapter 1, we talked about how the definition of psychology was originally all about thoughts and feelings, until John Watson came along and established that thoughts and feelings are not directly accessible. They're not publicly observable sources of data. Therefore, you had to go to a fallback position, overt patterns of behavior. And overt patterns of behavior are publicly observable and can be measured objectively. And to remind you of objective, that means everybody would use the same methodology to study it. You have the same issue here with respect to consciousness. You do not have a direct access to a person's thought or a feeling. You have to assess something else. That something else has to be overt patterns of behavior. Those patterns of behavior have to be publicly observable and measured in an objective manner. And as a result, our original definition of behavioral psychology from chapter 1 comes back to us here in the study of consciousness, which oftentimes implies internal events, but reminds you that you must evaluate the activity of the individual by evaluating the overt patterns of behavior. So no matter how much you want to concern yourself with thoughts or feelings, their dream states, or other aspects that you may think that go along with this, like what they're thinking when they're hypnotized, always, always, always you come back to a pattern of overt behavior. You simply cannot avoid it. Now, the study of consciousness formally got started in the very beginning of 1879 when the first laboratories were set up. Consciousness was actually one of the primary concerns of the early psychologists. And the reason why, when you go back to the history that we talked about in chapter 1, was the issue that Wilhelm Wundt, who was trained as a biologist, found employment in the Department of Philosophy. And so he took his background in biological science and tried to create experiments to evaluate the philosophical underpinnings of the work that was done in that department. Consequently, one of the most common things that philosophers would concern themselves with is the concept of consciousness. And that goes back many thousands of years. You certainly can find it in the early writings in Western civilization by the ancient Greeks, as well as other places around the globe. This issue of consciousness, as I've mentioned now, is much too broad to evaluate in the current time. However, it was, of course, too broad for people in 1879 to evaluate. As a result, the study of consciousness got broken down into smaller pieces, things like the evaluation of sensory experiences and perceptual experiences. So, in the previous chapter on sensation and perception, much of that early work that causes the terms Gestalt and Mueller-Lyer illusion to occur using these older German names and words was because the early psychologists were attempting to study consciousness but had to break it down into some subcomponent of consciousness that they could actually get their hands on in a laboratory, like sensory experiences and simple perceptual experiences. All of this is actually very much related to the story of consciousness here, because as consciousness starts being studied by the early psychologists, it unfortunately starts to get tied up with a lot of unscientific thinking. Even today, when you talk about consciousness, people have these very weird ideas, and I don't necessarily mean psychologists in general, although there is probably a sizable portion of psychologists today that still work with these ideas, but they think that consciousness is simply too big of an issue, that a brain just based on neural cells and action potentials could never actually give an individual the internal experiences that they express. And therefore, they argue that consciousness must be made up of other things, spirit entities or quantum mechanics or something else that's simply a large jump out of the basic research that you would apply from the standpoint of basic psychology or basic biology. So these supernatural explanations back in the 1800s were oftentimes referred to as metaphysics. The term metaphysics is essentially a dirty word in the field of science because it always implies some aspect of unscientific reasoning, because you oftentimes attribute aspects of things that you can't understand, like the fully functioning operation of consciousness, as being related to a spirit entity that exists inside your head. When this study of consciousness got started, it was, of course, called consciousness. But as the process of metaphysics started to get mixed up with it, the researchers that were holding to a very strong scientific standpoint started to realize that the field started to fall into ill repute. People did not respect consciousness research because too many consciousness researchers were referring to metaphysical operations. Consequently, many of the people that wanted to push a scientific approach simply pulled out, created their own area of awareness. Now notice what's happening. Sometime around 1910 or so, roughly, you start to see awareness studies occur. Now, what are awareness studies? Well, it's nothing more than consciousness studies, except you're distancing yourself from the people that say consciousness because you think they're doing a lot of hooey, right? Their work is just a load of BS at this point. So you're still studying consciousness, but you now use the word awareness. You simply use a new word as a euphemism for what you're originally studying to distance yourself from the people that you think are doing bad work. And this carries on fairly well starting around 1910 or so, roughly, and it carries on until around the 1950s, at which point the nonsense of metaphysics or even early 20th century neurological thinking starts to impinge upon the ideas of consciousness, but in ways that don't completely make sense with the science of the time. And as a result, the researchers that had been studying awareness, who were really technically studying consciousness in a scientific fashion, now have to distance themselves from the study of awareness. But a funny historical event occurs in the 1950s when this happens. In an entirely separate vein that we have never talked about, the study of memory, which was another piece of consciousness back in 1879 that had been pulled out as an experimental process that is workable in a laboratory, that's part of that broader study of consciousness, had been studied now for nearly 70 years. And the field of memory was actually making good headway into models of memory. And so by around the 1950s, Many of the researchers studying memory were using the term attention as the process that essentially referred to your conscious awareness of something. And notice when I say conscious awareness, I am actually using both of the words that were used historically, consciousness and awareness. Your conscious awareness of something was equal to your attention to it. It's just the word that the memory researchers happened to be using at the time. So as people jump ship from the study of awareness to distance themselves from scientific nonsense, they actually started to fall in with the memory researchers and started to use the word attention. From the 1950s clear up to today, nearly 7 decades, the study of memory has slowly gobbled up the study of consciousness, mainly because the study of memory has progressed in a scientific fashion from the 1879 start until today. And even in the 1960s, very well-established scientifically derived models of memory were created. Those models have continually been built upon up to the current time. Consequently, if you want to really study consciousness from a scientific standpoint, one of your best bets is to not go into the literature and look for research on consciousness or awareness, but to go into the literature and look for studies on memory. Because memory, whether you're talking about human consciousness or animal consciousness, memory is always a part of consciousness. And if you ultimately want to study consciousness, you are going to have to understand memory. If you want to study consciousness today, I would get on board with the study of memory because it has a long history of scientific applications. As research in memory has progressed over time, a couple of terms otherwise have developed that we will deal with as we go through these chapters, and in fact will actually show up more in the memory chapter when we reach it. The concept of working memory started to appear during the 1960s. Working memory is somewhat of a more specific term referring to what you're actually paying attention to. And I admit it is difficult still to talk about your mental activity that draws its attention to one specific thing to the exclusion of all else and having a good description for that process. You know, you could call it your consciousness of that thing or your awareness of it, your attention. In the specific memory models starting from the 1960s, you start to say working memory, the process of memory that's operating at the current time. These are not just changes in terms, as we'll eventually see in the memory chapter, but rather you will wind up seeing that these terms come with very specific processes and operations related to memory models that very much restrict and put parameters on what working memory means. So it's not just a general term that can mean anything. It means something very, very specific. And you have to get to the memory chapter to really understand the parameters of what working memory actually implies. Come the 1980s, an additional aspect that draws out of memory research as well, something called executive function, which is essentially the highest level of decision making that a person can make. It's probably, to say this in a general sense, most closely related to what you would refer to as the little voice in your head that helps you make decisions about things. And without putting too fine of a point on it, that concept of executive function, which again also has clearly objective definitions and clear parameters with respect to the manner in which it operates, is therefore much more easily understandable in experiments, and how it operates and how it fits into the broader aspect of sensation and perception and learning and all the other psychological processes we talk about this semester is all sort of reserved for the memory chapter. Now, consciousness comes in a variety of levels. Again, as a reminder, consciousness is a very broad construct. The idea that you have consciousness refers to the operation of all the activity of your brain at any one moment in time. And depending upon the biological and environmental conditions you're under, those different subsystems will work together in different ways and produce completely different types of output. So there's so many different ways that you can categorize consciousness that in general, many consciousness researchers have a concept of multiple levels of awareness. And these levels that you see on the screen here are a set of 7 layers of consciousness that are a set of 5 levels of analysis that are not universally accepted, but generally follow the framework of what most consciousness researchers work with. If you were to go from consciousness textbook to consciousness textbook, you would find in each book a different set of levels of awareness of consciousness. And because there's no universally accepted set of levels of awareness, these are simply my set of 5 that roughly fit what most consciousness researchers work with. Higher levels of consciousness essentially refer to times during which you are highly focused on some topic. In fact, so highly focused that you may become unaware of events around you. So examples like this might be a time where you're really focused on trying to solve a difficult math problem, and then your friend taps you on your shoulder and says, "Hey, I've been talking to you for the past minute. Why don't you answer me?" And that's when you realize that you have completely excluded anything else other than you're thinking about the math problem at that time. A lower level of consciousness from that oftentimes is much broader in terms of what you're paying attention to. You typically are daydreaming, or as most people would just generally say, because daydreaming sounds like a negative connotation, thinking. You're thinking. So maybe you took a walk, and while you were taking a walk, you were just thinking about your life. Doesn't mean that you're going to step off into the street and not realize a car's coming and wind up getting hit. It doesn't mean you're not going to notice your neighbors and avoid saying hello to them. You're thinking about something, but you're also generally aware of your entire environment as well. That would be referred to as a lower level of consciousness. An altered state of consciousness, which by the way is oftentimes the term most closely associated with nonsense in the entire field of psychology. People have taken that term and have made it mean darn near everything. But an altered state of consciousness is really a very simple concept to understand. If consciousness is what you're aware of, an altered state of consciousness means that you're simply more likely aware of something else under particular conditions. So let's suppose a person took some drug. You go to the hospital and you're partially anesthetized, or you're made very sleepy so you can get through somewhat of a painful or bothersome medical procedure. You're less aware of the problematic medical procedure as a result of the use of the drugs, and that's simply an altered state of consciousness. Doesn't mean that very odd things are happening. You simply are redirecting the person's ability to pay attention to something that might be somewhat painful and letting them relax during that time. If you were drinking too much coffee, you might be overly sensitive to people speaking to you or being interrupted, and you might have a tendency to become angry or be agitated. Certainly, after a long period of time, if you continue to drink coffee throughout the entire day, you may be very, very irritable. Trauma. In cases of trauma, like if you were in a car accident, even if you didn't hit your head, the experience of fear from being in that traumatic event very likely will cause you to not pay very good attention to the environment after the event had occurred. So you would say you're dazed and confused. You're not paying attention well. In fact, when you're asked about the event, the car accident, you may even express how time seemed to slow down, which obviously it did not, but it's your internal experience and your memory of the event that time slowed down. And that's simply the description being given by altered state of consciousness. Tiredness as well, which certainly is something that you probably experience as a college student. If you're tired, it's going to be difficult to read a textbook for long periods of time because the book may be somewhat boring. And as a result, because you're only sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night, you can only study in shorter periods, or you may try to cram in a whole lot and realize you just read 3 pages and you have no idea what you've been reading. Not an efficient way to go, of course, but it would be related to the general idea of an altered state of consciousness. Beneath that, you have what's referred to as subconscious awareness. And in subconscious awareness, the idea is you're not conscious. Okay, so really you are probably sleeping in most cases, knocked out somehow. Not necessarily with anesthetics, but you are unconscious. And during that time, you wind up having some sort of experience like a dream. And then when you wake up, you can then talk about the experience you had. So being asleep on your couch in your apartment and then waking up and telling a whole story about having been at a carnival and meeting your dead grandparents was a story that happened in a dream. But it's part of an experience that occurred when you were actually only in your apartment. You didn't travel off to another universe and actually meet your dead grandparents. You simply were dreaming. And as a result, it's called a subconscious form of awareness. And beneath that, about the lowest level of consciousness you can attain is really no awareness at all. With respect to no awareness, what you typically have is being unconscious and no dreaming. And that actually happens when you are anesthetized. It's sort of a odd happenstance that most drugs that function well as anesthetics also block dreaming. So when a person is anesthetized, they generally have a complete blank in their experience from the point that they go to sleep to the point where they wake up is just gone. There's no memory whatsoever. And in fact, partly as I'm recording this video as a result of the COVID-19 lockdown, you hear this quite a bit from the people that are induced into comas and placed on respirators for 2, 3, 4 weeks at a time. During that time, while they have to be on a respirator to save their life, the individual has no memory of anything during those 2, 3, 4 weeks that they're on the respirator. That's really rather remarkable. So they go to sleep and they wake up later as though in their own perceptual experience, it was the same day. Of course, they feel differently, and there's going to be muscle atrophy and so forth, but they will have no memory of that event. And so it's like they went to sleep and woke up just a moment later. Each of these levels of awareness are referred to as fuzzy categories. Fuzzy categories are categories that don't have clear ends to them. They sort of blend into each other. So for each of these 5 categories, the higher level of consciousness, lower level, altered states, subconscious, and no awareness, they all tend to blend from one to the next, so there are not very clear delineations between them. If you could establish very clear parametric delineations between the categories, then almost certainly you would have a set of universally acceptable levels of consciousness. Because you don't, because you are in the realm of fuzzy categories, is one of the reasons why there are no universally accepted sets of levels of awareness. Let's take a look at a question related to this material of the levels of consciousness. Other than the no awareness category, all states of consciousness involve what? Simply C, various levels of attention. Because attention and consciousness and awareness are all synonyms for each other, you are looking at various levels of attention for the various levels of consciousness. Now, there are some things that we need to concern ourselves regarding the study of consciousness. Part of them come from the historical aspects of consciousness itself. Remember always that when psychology got started in 1879, it was a biologist inside of a philosophy department. The philosophy department essentially handed that biologist this concept of consciousness. This is the thing we're studying. This is what's important. And of course, the biologist, Wundt, wanted to use his background in biology to study things scientifically. So it was in 1879 that the context for what psychology would actually be first started to be set. And as it was set during the coming decades up until, let's say, 1910, roughly, all of the types of thinking about biology and human behavior, what human life was about, what the potential of human beings was, the general time frame then colored the impression of what psychology was. And this lent itself to many concepts from the late 1800s that you might not necessarily see so much now in the 21st century. But because psychology started at that time, some of these concepts like mental conflict started to be developed and are now still with us. If psychology started today, the concepts of mental conflict very well might not actually exist, simply because of the way that biology itself is understood, that there would be variations on how psychological theorizing would take place. So it's important to recognize concepts like mental conflict are with us today only because psychology started in 1879, when there was a time in which the concept of mental conflict might actually serve better purpose than it would today. So one of the things that I have to make sure you're very aware of is that as consciousness was studied in the late 1800s, early 20th century, many very vague ideas about mental conflict, like wanting to do something and also at the same time not wanting to do something, were concepts that early psychologists dealt with. They dealt with them in very general ways. They did not have the capacity or the database to very clearly identify what it meant to both want something and not want something at the same time. So they spoke about these things in very general ways. This led to concepts of mental conflict. And in many cases, for early clinical psychologists like Sigmund Freud, who you no doubt heard of, generated concepts that people have this mental conflict as a purely internal state that may be beneath their level of awareness, but that it drives their personality development. Now keep this in mind. So you're proposing mental conflict of some sort. I want this, but I don't want this. And that occurs without you being aware of it. So it's below your level of consciousness, so called subconscious, and it has a grand effect on your behavior. This was the way many early psychologists kind of dealt with psychology. This probably sounds somewhat reasonable to you today, oftentimes because these ideas are still with us generally in the social realm. Not so much in scientific psychology, but in the social realm. The way in which people in our society have learned to talk about psychological operations largely as the field of psychology has spread. People have learned about it, but of course are not psychologists themselves, and these ideas carry over and roll on decade after decade, that this mental conflict concept still floats around. But you don't really see it from scientific psychologists because so much of it does not fit the basics of science. It does not allow for an objective measure because you're talking about mental conflict that occurs beneath a person's awareness. So how could you even study it? Right? You can't even ask the person to describe their mental conflict because technically it's even outside of their own understanding. So then they would have nothing to say. So then you would have to guess at what's actually going on inside their head. And that just is a losing proposition. At least at the current time, given that psychology's been around for 14 decades, it's clear that doing that kind of guesswork is always a losing proposition. One other aspect that kind of comes out of this whole story is the story of subliminal messages. In the Sensation of Perception chapter, I talked about how subliminal messages were supposed to be messages that you could detect beneath the 50% level, and that they would have some grand effect on your behavior, but you would not be aware of having detected them because they were below your threshold. And that concept, again, here should start to sound a little bit fishy. If you can't detect something well enough to become aware of it, then it's a weak stimulus. And the basic rule from the Sensation of Perception chapter is a weak stimulus produces a weak effect on your behavior, and a strong stimulus produces a strong effect on your behavior. So whenever a weak stimulus occurs, even if you're not fully aware of it, the best it can do is modify your behavior in very soft and gentle ways. But it cannot generate a grand experience or a large adjustment in behavior. So overall, the idea that people have mental conflict has largely been abandoned by scientific psychology. And the idea in consciousness from scientific psychologists that there are such things as subliminal messages that manage your behavior is also off the table. They have been studied again and again and again with lacking evidence to support those concepts. And after so many experiments of not finding any influence of them, you simply have to abandon it and move on to more fertile theorizing. This finally gets us into the network of aspects of consciousness. In fact, of all the things in consciousness we could talk about, one of the things we're going to focus on most are the concepts of sleeping and dreaming. In particular, sleeping. Largely because sleeping and dreaming are so well studied at this point in time that they lead to a lot of information that helps you understand consciousness for something that had traditionally been very much an internal experience. So, for example, dreaming and the experiences you have when you dream and why do you dream, and whether or not the content of your dream is a secret message that has to be decoded by you once you wake up, are all things that can actually be addressed in a scientific fashion today. In terms of sleep and dreaming, there are two specific cycles that you're going to see: a 90-minute cycle and a 24-hour cycle. The 24-hour cycle is an easy one. That refers to the fact that you generally have a lengthy period of sleep once every 24 hours. So basically, you go to bed at night and sleep for 8 hours. Probably more likely 5.5 hours given your part-time job and the fact that you're a college student, but let's just pretend 8 hours. And you do that once per day. That's essentially the 24-hour cycle. Now, the 90-minute cycle is one that you're probably much less aware of. The 90-minute cycle is related to the pattern in which you dream over the course of the evening. So, what may not be real obvious to you is that from the time that you first go to sleep, you will have dreams every 90 minutes in a regular fashion throughout the evening until the point at which you wake up. And those dream cycles may run from anywhere between 10 minutes up to about an hour toward the end of the evening. And we'll talk about the specific way these cycles change over time. But you always start a new dreaming period every 90 minutes. These cycles are relevant in terms of biology because they fit a broad area of study called the biological clock, sometimes referred to as circadian rhythms. Biological clock simply refers to biological patterns that occur in cycles either throughout the course of the day or over the course of days, as each of these 24 and 90-minute cycles do. One of the aspects that actually drives this that you see that occurs from its own cycle is exposure to sunlight. Back in the Sensation and Perception chapter, we talked about how light that enters your eye mostly goes back to your occipital lobe for you to see, but of some of the pathways that leave your retina, some of them don't make it to your occipital lobe. They simply go over to your hypothalamus and are used for affecting hormonal output based upon the amount of light that you're being exposed to. So under bright conditions, you tend to be more awake as a result of hormonal output, and when you are in a dark environment, you start to become more tired as a result of a change in hormonal output. And these aspects of exposure to light, which typically run 12-hour shifts over the course of the day as the sun rises to the point where the sun sets, influences your likelihood of feeling awake or tired simply based upon the amount of light that goes into your eyes. Now, as we talk about sleep, we are going to talk about the sleep stages that a person goes through. And in fact, it's easiest on the slide if we look at the bottom bullet points. Sleep has 5 particular stages. Stages 1, 2, 3, 4, and REM. Those are the 5 stages of sleep. And in fact, those stages follow in that order. So when you first go to sleep, you go into stage 1, then you go to stage 2, then into stage 3, then into stage 4. And from stage 4, as that's the limiting factor, you now start to work your way back to stage 3, then to stage 2. And then when you would get back to numerical stage number 1, you replace it with REM sleep. And you may or may not know that REM sleep is the sleep period in which you dream. We'll talk about that more on the coming slides, but note the pattern, which is very important. You're going to be held to understanding this. When you go to sleep, you go into stage 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, work your way back to 3 to 2, and you never return to stage 1 again. You replace stage 1 with REM sleep. So stage 1, if we take a look at the bullet point above it, is a unique stage when you first start to fall asleep that includes something called hypnagogic sensations. And hypnagogic sensations are simply a reference to particular characteristics that occur as you first start to fall asleep. One of them is what you oftentimes may perceive of as a little mini dream. They are technically called hallucinations. Now, what these mini dreams or hallucinations are, they are perceptually exactly the same as a dream. However, they can be distinguished from dreams by the electrical activity that comes off of your brain. Therefore, they have to be categorized differently. Be aware that your perceptual experience of these mini dreams or hallucinations are exactly like dreams, but they are technically not dreams because they can be distinguished from dreams by the electrical activity off your head. Secondly, you will always have a feeling of falling or weightlessness during stage 1. Most of the time you're not aware of this because as you fall asleep and go into stage 1, you most of the time will remain asleep and then progress into stage 2 and 3 and 4 and so on. Occasionally, however, you will wake up as a result of the disruptive influence of that feeling of falling or weightlessness. The feeling of weightlessness often involves kind of a feeling of floating and tingling, and that itself may start to make you wake up. Secondly, a feeling of falling may occur, which is a bit more disruptive. That I think you become more aware of if you start falling asleep in a chair in the middle of the day and you kind of jerk awake. That's exactly what happened. If you suddenly jerk yourself awake, that's proof that you have actually fully fallen asleep and you are in stage 1. And during stage 1 sleep that you had just experienced, you had a feeling of falling. That feeling of falling caused you to wake up, and therefore you became aware of it. If you did not wake up, then you would never actually be aware of it and you would not remember it. Because there's one additional thing about sleeping that I had not mentioned, and that is your memory system is not going to work very well. When you go to sleep, you do not form any long-term memories. You can only form short-term memories. And short-term memories only have a lifespan of about 30 to 60 seconds. So I'm going to just generically say 30 seconds. And so for the time during which you're asleep and possibly dreaming, you can only remember 30 seconds of a dream, no matter how long that dream is. And I mentioned earlier in this lecture that you might possibly dream as long as 1 hour, which is absolutely true. And if you woke up at the end of that 1 hour dream, you only have the capacity to remember the last 30 seconds of it. And that is going to put a big damper on whether or not you think you can analyze your own dreams, because it's like reading a novel and only ever remembering the last few pages of it. So in this particular cycle, stage 1, once you fall asleep, you always have these experiences that are just like dreams but are technically called hallucinations, and you will always have an experience of falling or weightlessness. If they don't cause you to wake up, then you simply won't remember them in the morning because you only have a memory that will retain about 30 seconds of information during the time that you're asleep. And if you do stay asleep, you will go from that stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 to stage 4 and then work your way back to stage 3 to stage 2 and then into REM sleep, the period where you're actually going to be dreaming. Remember that you don't ever return to stage 1. You always replace it with REM sleep. One last comment about this slide. If you take a look at stage 1 sleep, it is always the very first stage of sleep that you go into. You only ever go into it once over the course of the evening, and it's the only sleep stage that involves hypnagogic sensations. That makes stage 1 unique for those 3 properties. It's always the first, you only go into it once, it's the only one with hypnagogic sensations. So let me ask you a question now about this. In which sleep stage does sleepwalking occur? Well, the correct answer here is D, stages 3 and 4. And why I point that out now without having brought up the issue of sleepwalking already is simply to distinguish that sleepwalking is not dreaming. When a person is sleepwalking, they will be in stages 3 or 4. But dreaming occurs when you're in REM sleep, and REM sleep is a replacement for stage 1 sleep. So dreaming and sleepwalking are entirely separate processes. There may appear on the outer surface of it dreaming and a plot line occurring and some of the odd behavior that a sleepwalker may do, but they are not the same process. And it's very important that you grasp the difference between those 2 systems. We will talk about sleepwalking more in detail later in this chapter. Now let's take a look at how dreaming occurs over the course of the evening. As dreaming occurs, you will go through the various sleep stages as you see here, from stage 1 down to 4 and then back up to REM sleep. Note that REM sleep is always in the red bar, and it is along the figure where numerical stage 1 would be, but it's just drawn this way as a recognition that you return to a location where you would have been at numerical stage 1, but you replace it with REM sleep. In fact, the electrical activity of stage 1 sleep is actually very similar to the electrical activity of REM sleep, which very well may account for the fact that you have those perceptual mini dreams in stage 1, but they are sufficiently different from REM sleep that you can distinguish them. But they're still within the same general class of brain activity that would give you this internal hallucinatory effect of dreaming. To understand this figure, we're going to play a little game, and that game is you always fall asleep at midnight. And the reason we do that is because, as I've mentioned earlier, and as you can see on the figure, you will always go into dreaming periods every 90 minutes. And so if we always have you fall asleep at midnight, it simply makes the math of counting ahead in 90-minute intervals easier to deal with. Because it's simpler to say, I fell asleep at midnight, and then I dreamt at my first time period at 1:30, and then at 3, and then at 4:30, and then at 6. That's easy. We don't want you falling asleep at 11:19 and having to count ahead 90 minutes from that, which might cause confusion for some of you. Now, the other aspect of this is the brainwave pattern along the x-axis. Alpha waves and also beta waves, which are not shown there, are associated with wakefulness. And then the brainwave patterns from stage 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the patterns that you first experience over the course of the evening. But there is a consistent way in which the type of brainwave pattern changes from alpha down to stage 4. Alpha waves have a very low amplitude and a very fast cycle. So there's a very, very short wavelength and a very, very low amplitude. That's what alpha waves look like. all the way at the other end, at stage 4, you have a very high amplitude and a very long wavelength. Now these are the two endpoints that you need to remember, and the rest of them are going to be very simple. If alpha waves have a very low amplitude and a very short wavelength, and stage 4 has the opposite, a very high amplitude, very long wavelength, then the relationship from alpha to stage 4 is just a continual change of higher and higher amplitudes and longer wavelengths. Simple. So remember that alpha waves, low amplitude, short wavelength; stage 4, high amplitude, long wavelengths. And a just continuous change of increasing wavelength and increasing amplitude across those stages. Now, as you first fall asleep at midnight, you will go through all of the various stages until at 1:30 you will start to have your first dream cycle. Now, in some way that I cannot explain to you, your body anticipates that it's going to go through all of these various stages, and it essentially distributes the amount of time you are in each stage equally between the various sleep stages for the first 90 minutes of sleep. So if you're in sleep stage 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 3, then 2, then REM, and you add up the total number of stages that you're in during that time, which is 7, you could take the 90-minute duration you're in, divide that by the 7 total stages of sleep that you had experienced, and get roughly about 13 minutes per stage. And that's a reasonable estimate of the length of time you will be in stage 1 and stage 2 and stage 3 and stage 4 and back to stage 3, back to stage 2, and into REM sleep. Approximately 13 minutes apiece. This means that having fallen asleep at midnight is essentially a guarantee, whoever you are, no matter where on the planet you are going to have a 13-minute dream at 1:30 in the morning. And then it progresses on again. You will then go back into stage 2, 3, 4, back to 3 to 2, and then up into REM. As you sleep over the course of the evening, your body will acquire a sufficient amount of stage 4 sleep, and then you will not go into stage 4 any longer. The same thing will also happen with stage 3 sleep. Eventually you'll acquire enough stage 3 sleep, and then you'll only go down to stage 2. So toward the end of the evening, you see that you're going to be spending approximately 45 minutes in REM sleep and in stage 2. Why do you know that it's 45 minutes? Well, because the 90-minute cycle is a constant. That will never change. So you're always going to dream in every 90-minute time period. And if you only have 2 stages to go into, REM and stage 2, then it's essentially a guarantee you'll be in each one for about 45 minutes duration. To be clear, this figure does not show an exact, universally accepted version of how sleep occurs for every single person all around the globe. The basic rule is you will go down to stage 4, and then eventually you'll stop going there and you'll only go down to stage 3. And then for your specific biological and environmental conditions, you will then eventually only go down to stage 2. And after you bounce between REM and 2 for some time, you will eventually wake up. That's essentially the rule. So everybody's sleep pattern may look a little bit different, but there are going to be some overarching standardized processes that you can expect to see. One of the other aspects about this that I'll just make mention of if you're curious about, and that is what happens in a case like this, the way I've drawn this. It would appear that this subject, this hypothetical subject represented by this figure, is essentially sleeping about 7.5 hours a night. So maybe they sleep about 8 hours a night normally. Well, what happens if they only get to sleep 5.5 hours a night? Or what if they sleep 11 hours over the course of the evening? What would actually happen to this cycle? Well, the answer there is this. This cycle will function like an accordion. So if, for you, you only sleep 5 hours per night, this same figure will simply shrink itself up in distance in time, but the same overall pattern will be held. And if, let's say it's summertime, you don't have a part-time job and you can do whatever you want, you start sleeping 11 hours a day, this entire cycle will simply expand, but the same pattern will hold. It won't change in any other qualitative fashion other than just stretching itself out. And this is one of the things that you see if you take more advanced classes on sleeping and dreaming. The pattern of sleep stages that occur over the course of the evening are tied to the overall relative size of the stage of sleep that you go into for each of the individual cycles and for the length of time you sleep at night. So the entire structure functions like a spring or an accordion. It always holds the same relative shape, but that shape can shrink or expand. When you dream, I mentioned that is called REM sleep. And REM is an acronym that refers to rapid eye movement. And the stage got its name because in the 1950s, when it was first discovered, researchers noticed that an individual that was dreaming had their eyes darting around underneath of their eyelids. And so it was a very simple thing to refer to it as rapid eye movement sleep. Of course, upon waking an individual whose eyes were darting around their head, there was about a 90% chance that the individual indicated that they were dreaming. And as a result, dreaming had become correlated with rapid eye movement. Now, please note, I told you that there is roughly about a 90% chance that a person reports a dream when they wake up in rapid eye movement. If I told you it was a 100% chance, you might be able to make an argument for cause and effect relationship. The fact that there's only a 90% probability of a dream being reported during all the instances of REM sleep indicate that REM and dreaming are highly correlated together, but not necessarily causing one to the other. There is not necessarily a cause and effect relationship. REM sleep does not necessarily cause dreaming, and dreaming does not necessarily cause REM sleep. You have to fall back on the logic that we dealt with in terms of correlations back in Chapter 1. There may be a third process, process Z, theoretical process Z, which is actually causing dreaming and REM sleep to occur at the same time. Those possibilities still exist, and I can only lay this out in a clear sense as identifying REM and dreaming as highly correlated, but unlikely to be cause and effect related to each other. Now, when a person has REM sleep and they are dreaming, one of the things that you're going to see is body paralysis. Now, body paralysis is a process by which all of the outgoing messages from your primary motor cortex are blocked in your brainstem so that the activity of your primary motor cortex never actually reaches your muscles and makes your body move. Now, this occurs during REM sleep, which in a way that appears to be related to an adaptive protective process for an individual. If you did not block the outgoing motor messages from your brain, you would automatically act your dreams out. And that, as you might imagine, would be very possibly dangerous, because upon acting your dreams out, when you're unconscious, you might become hurt. So there appears to be this theoretical explanation that your body blocks the activity, but that causes you to become literally paralyzed. That is, any motor control for your muscles that emanates from your brain is blocked, and therefore your body goes completely limp and you're paralyzed. Now, you may have some feeling for this already, some indication that this process is something you've already experienced, and I think most of us actually have. The reason why is if you're in REM sleep and you're having a nightmare, the nightmare, generically we could say, is exciting, right? Not exciting in a good sense, obviously, but it's emotionally exciting because it's a horrible, horrible nightmare. That excitement actually causes you to wake up. And as you wake up, you may feel that you cannot move. You can't move. What's actually happening is, as you're transitioning from REM sleep to wakefulness, as you start to wake up, you begin to realize that you're paralyzed. And it's the body paralysis of REM sleep that you're actually experiencing. So this typically happens during nightmares and not happy dreams. Because if you're having a happy dream that you are skipping in a field of poppies with the Care Bears, there's nothing there that will cause you to wake up. But if you're having a horrible dream that a monster is about to kill you, that is emotionally disturbing. That causes you to wake up. And as you wake up, you become consciously aware of the body paralysis, which oftentimes adds to the agitation and uncomfortableness of the dream itself, because in your state of waking, you may be partially experiencing the dream, somewhat partially experiencing reality, and at the same time unable to move your body, which is somewhat disturbing. These experiences are actually very common. They've been written about in ancient writings, oftentimes, of course, associated with the activity of evil spirits and types of ghosts that enter your body and so forth, but they are very much clearly recognized to be related to the activity of body paralysis today. Now, I have a couple of movies to show you here that are all very important. In this first video I'm going to show you, that runs about 7 minutes long, you're going to see some of the description of the historical development of REM sleep and the beginning of sleep laboratories. And please note that sleeping and dreaming were really not studied in a scientific fashion until the 1950s, some of the footage of which you'll actually see in this video. So the work on sleeping and dreaming is relatively young. If you want to say 70 years or so, 7 decades is young, it is essentially in terms of a scientific standpoint. So there's still a lot to learn about sleeping and dreaming, but once the work on sleeping and dreaming starts to take place, it really very rapidly starts to undercut the traditional understanding of dreaming and coded messages and all of the other cultural aspects of dreaming that had developed literally over the course of thousands of years.
In 1953, when Nathaniel Kleitman and Eugene Azarinsky began recording people's brainwaves as they slept through the night.
They put electrodes onto the head that could pick up the electrical activity of the brain underneath. And they had known when people are awake that signal looks very fast and not too interesting. It looks almost like noise. But that when people fall asleep, that you would sometimes have the brain activity start to go up and down in a slow pattern. And you could then tell whether someone was awake or asleep, or so they thought.
The researchers had assumed sleeping brains were resting brains. But every 90 minutes or so, as their subjects slumbered, something odd happened.
Their eyes were closed, their head had drooped, they didn't answer when you called them by name. They were clearly asleep, but the electrical activity of the brain said they were awake.
And it wasn't just their brain waves that seemed strange. They were sexually aroused. Their heart rates and breathing had become irregular. Their eyes darted about beneath shut lids. It was these eye movements that gave the state its name, rapid eye movement, or REM sleep. But what was REM sleep for? The answer seemed to come from the sleepers themselves.
During REM sleep, what the researchers invariably found when they woke up a subject was the subject would report, "Hey, I'm dreaming, and I just had a vivid dream."
So was REM sleep dream sleep? The idea seemed more than plausible when you considered REM's most dramatic characteristic.
Another feature of REM sleep is that your muscle tone just goes absolutely down to zero. You become functionally paralyzed. If you're sitting up in a chair watching TV, and the head nods and falls and you fall asleep, that's not REM sleep. If you fell into REM sleep, you would literally roll off the chair onto the floor because your body becomes absolutely relaxed, almost paralyzed in the sense that you can't make your muscles actually work. And it becomes absolutely calm and non-responsive.
Nature, it appeared, had devised a special state of paralysis to house our dreams, one in which they remained internal experiences. It was a conclusion that seemed impossible to deny when researchers learned to switch the paralysis off. This cat looks as if it's awake. In fact, it's deep in REM sleep. This dog appears to be running. It too is in REM sleep, and like the cat, dreaming. To see these dreams played out, scientists disabled the part of the brain that paralyzes muscles during REM sleep.
And what we see when you do this with cats in particular is that they can walk around during REM sleep and their behavior is not random. It's not chaotic. They're not just doing any old crazy thing. They appear to be doing the kinds of behaviors that cats like to do, like stalk a prey, play with a mouse or something. So presumably that's what they dream about when they go into REM sleep. So that's what we think is happening.
But what about people? Could human dreams be watched as well? Performing surgical experiments on human subjects was, of course, unthinkable. But the discovery of a new brain disease also made it unnecessary.
Well, it was me telling him he's got to go to the doctors and sort this out, because I'd have to jump out of bed quick.
Tom Kersley has a condition known as REM sleep disorder. It prevents the paralysis of REM sleep, so he acts out his dreams.
I can picture now being in this field, a river in the background, and I don't know, about a dozen cows grazing in the grass, and they slowly start coming towards me and nudging me and pushing me out of the way.
He's shouting and raging about everywhere. The
It's
bedside
these
cabinet
tablets,
went over the other night and he didn't even know he'd knocked that over.
Dr. John Schneerson is an expert on this condition.
The
It's absolutely classical for the REM sleep behaviour disorder. It's just what happens. Often starts off with movements which the partner thinks is a bit unusual, but nothing special, just kicking in, just a bad dream. But it becomes more frequent, more intense, and so it can be dangerous for the partner and dangerous for the dreamer. In fact, a lot of people with this condition end up with nothing in the bedroom at all. They take out all the bedside tables, all the lamps, all the sharp corners which might injure themselves. They end up almost in a padded cell.
Not all sufferers have nightmares. Here, a sleeper puffs on his finger monitor, dreaming it's a cigarette.
Another patient was dreaming that there were animals coming in the room, and when he woke up, he was on the mantelpiece. And I found it difficult to get off there. In fact, he didn't know how he got up there. He must have been very agile to get up there and very motivated to get that far.
REM sleep disorder seemed to suggest that dreams were important. Why else would nature go to such lengths to let most of us dream safely? Such a conclusion might have seemed obvious, but by the late 70s, a new theory was roiling psychology. It came from Harvard researchers Alan Hobson and Robert McCarley.
And it stressed the fact that there's a particular part of our brainstem that triggers REM sleep, sending up signals to the higher parts of the brain that were kind of random and chaotic.
Dreams, the researchers argued, were more physiological than psychological, the result of our higher brain doing the best it could to make sense of meaningless neural impulses.
Now, that led them to say that dreams have some psychological coherence, some pattern, but they have no purpose, and certainly not the psychological purpose that Freud claimed for them.
Okay, so there you got to see some of the beginning of the research on REM sleep, how it occurred, how REM sleep is understood through research with animals, and how it appears that animals dream essentially similar to human beings in that you do things and interact with things that are normal in your everyday life, as well as the issue of body paralysis, which is very important because body paralysis only occurs during REM sleep. It does not occur in stage 1 or stage 2 or stage 3 or stage 4. It only occurs during REM sleep, and that's a very important thing to remember because REM is when you're dreaming and you will have lots of motor activity in your primary motor cortex, and the activity there will simply follow the pathways out to your muscles because remember, your brain operates on a basic biochemical process. It doesn't think itself, it just has these underlying chemical processes that make things operate. Now the next video we're going to watch here, before we have a couple of questions, is related to the difference between REM dreaming and non-REM dreaming. Generally, within the past 20 years, there has been a discovery of dreaming in non-REM states. So that's dreaming in stage 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. In fact, typically non-REM dreaming focuses on dreaming in stages 2, 3, and 4. As it turns out, the quality and content of dreaming in REM is different than it is in the non-REM stages. And this video will underscore those differences.
At Harvard, meanwhile, Robert Stickgold is focusing on the dreams of non-REM sleep. He too recruits human subjects to sleep over in his lab. But first, they get an assignment.
So John here is mostly just having a lot of fun. He's learning how to play this game, Alpine Racer 2, which is a downhill skiing simulator. He actually controls that character on the screen by moving his feet, and he's learning a lot about how to do it. And what we think is that as the brain goes to sleep, it's going to come back to these images.
It's intense. I'm trying to beat a time, and I'm trying to stay in between these gates, and it's difficult, but it's a lot of fun.
That night, John is awakened repeatedly during non-REM sleep and asked about his dreams. Early on, they're simple reenactments of the ski game, but as the night passes, they begin to incorporate other memories.
Please report now.
I was walking through boot prints in the snow, already made boot prints, like copying them, going into the ones, stepping into the ones that were already stepped in, like following somebody else's steps along in the snow.
What he's dreaming about is how much easier it is to walk through the snow if you go exactly where you stepped last time. And just imagine the brain trying to say, does what I know about walking in snow help me think about skiing on snow?
Such a dream, Stickgold believes, does far more than while away the night.
And I think this is all about the function of sleep and the role of dreaming in processing memories, that it refines the memory, it improves the memory, it makes the memory more useful for the future. And so when they come back, they're going to be better.
And John is better. The next day on the virtual slopes, his performance has clearly improved.
I always end up hitting the wall coming up on this part, but we'll see if I can avoid it. Yeah. That's pretty good.
We know that they're getting better when they play again. And in other studies, we have evidence that when they dream about it, those people who dream about it actually end up performing better the next time.
If non-REM dreams help us learn, then what about the dreams of REM sleep? What do they accomplish? And how might the two kinds of dreaming work together? At MIT, a scientist who eavesdrops on the dreams of rats may be nearing an answer. By placing electrodes in a rat's brain, Matt Wilson can read its mind, seeing exactly how its brain cells, or neurons, fire as it experiences its world. In this case, a maze.
Individual neurons will respond based upon what the animal is doing, where it is in the maze. So wherever the animal is, we see unique patterns of brain activity.
Each of these patterns corresponds to a specific place in the maze explored by the rat. But remarkable as it is to look in on a rodent's inner life, the big payoff comes later. As the rat sleeps, the patterns recur, seen here as flashes of color superimposed on the maze.
So the animal is asleep, it's not moving, it's not interacting with the world. And yet we see a lot of structured activity going on in the brain. And when we look in detail at that activity, we see that these patterns are direct reflections of patterns that we had seen when the animal was awake.
Wilson is convinced he has found a way to watch a rat dream and know what it's dreaming about. In this instance, running a maze.
And I think that was really the moment of great insight. Not simply that there was dreaming going on, but that we had access to this.
Like humans, rats have two distinct dream types, and Wilson is homing in on their differences. During non-REM sleep, their dreams play out as brief bursts of neural activity, which mirrors past experience, compressed into seconds.
Now, when we get to REM sleep, now things change dramatically. Memories are replayed, but they're not compressed, they're not accelerated, they don't occur in these small fragments. They are played out as though the animal were actually experiencing, moving through a world, but that world is being generated from the inside.
In fact, REM dreams can be 5 times longer than non-REM dreams. And in human beings at least, they are anything but a simple replay of the past.
So the speculation is that during non-REM sleep, the brain is taking the past and trying to figure out how that might relate to the future. And in REM, actually trying to experience the future, move into the future.
The dreams of REM, in other words, may be simulations, which allow us to face challenges and test possibilities.
My sense is that when we're asleep and when we're dreaming, we are actually conscious and figuring out what's important about what happened to us and how that relates to everything else that's happened to us in the past, and figuring out what that means about our future.
And when you think about the challenge that animals, that we as humans and the brain in general faces, it is the unknown of the future. And in REM, we may have the opportunity to step into that future world with no risk, because the consequences are simply things don't work out as you might have expected, and then you wake up. So these states may be what are essential for allowing us as individuals to reach our maximal level of potential.
So the description of REM sleep and non-REM dreaming may be very foreign to you. These are things that you typically don't hear about when you hear about psychological functioning. But they are very important. And this idea that essentially your brain is running through a thinking and decision-making process when you're unconscious is actually rather unique and, of course, very interesting. It matches well with the number of scientific discoveries that people have made throughout the centuries because they dreamt the solution to a problem, woke up and wrote it down. Of course, as you know, there's a fine line you have to draw there because you only have about 30 seconds of memory for any dream. So for a person that dreams a solution to a problem, they have to wake up right at the end of that dream, and the relevant aspects of the solution have to have been right at the very end of the dream, and then they have to get it written down before they wind up forgetting it. Makes you wonder whether or not more of this would actually happen if you had better access to it. But that is, of course, just conjecture on my part as we go into a couple of questions about sleeping and dreaming. Take a look at this graph. This is the same figure you have been working with earlier. Will you be able to talk about your dream if you fall asleep at midnight and wake up at 2 a.m.? Stop the video, look at the figure very carefully, and I'll give you the answer in a moment. And the correct answer there is no, you will not be able to remember your dream if you wake up at 2 a.m. And the reason is, if you fall asleep at midnight, then you will start dreaming for about 13 minutes, which is something we established in earlier slides. About 13-minute dream period will occur from about 1:30 to 1:43. If you wake up at 2 a.m., that's much longer than the 30-second memory you have while you're asleep, and therefore, if you wake up at 2 a.m., your perceptual experience would be, hey, I didn't have any dreams, simply because you don't remember them. Approximately, what is the probability you will wake up during a dream from 4:30 a.m. onward? Again, we're using the same figure, so I have not adjusted anything. Pause the video, take a close look at it, and I'll give you the answer in a moment. So the probability you'll wake up during a dream from 4:30 a.m. onward is C, 50%. And the reason is, from 4:30 until the point where you wake up, you're only in REM sleep or stage 2 sleep. And therefore, with only 2 stages, there's a 50% probability that you will wake up when you are in REM sleep.